Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again on this month's edition of the Mold Pros webinar series. Um, we are really excited to be hosting Dr. Miles Nichols, who's going to be talking about mental illness and brain autoimmunity. And obviously, this is a big point, and it's getting more and more attention nowadays of how different toxins can affect different types of mental illnesses, either like psychiatric or physical mental illnesses, and the role that toxins play in this connection here. So I'm really excited because Dr. Nichols is really the first in our series here to be talking about the autoimmunity effect of this. So I'm really interested to hear what he has to say. So take us away, Dr. Nichols.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to educate around this because I really feel this is an important thing that there's a lot of misunderstanding around. So before I dive into the specifics around mental illness and brain autoimmunity, as a big picture overview, I'd like to say that there's a tendency that I have that I think everyone has is to want to reduce down to as small and easy to understand of an explanation for why things are happening as possible. I think the brain is wired to try to look for simple understandings. And it's easy to say mental illness has a single root cause. What's the smoking gun? Where is it that is the source? And that's a good way of thinking because it goes deeper than just looking at symptoms. It looks at root causes, but it's also limited in that when people think about mental illness, sometimes on the psychologic side of it's trauma and it's the mind and it's mental emotional stuff, and we need to work there. That sometimes limits a person's ability to understand and think about the physiological side of what might be happening on the brain chemistry, the brain immune function. And if someone focuses too much on the neurochemistry, they might forget that there are opportunities related to brain retraining practices, counseling, psychological practices. So my hope here is to educate about some of the physiological side to a large degree here of the way that we can see the onset of mental illness that's often ignored and not talked about. And I want to put it in the context from the very beginning here that this does not discount any treatment related to counseling, to psychologic intervention. And in fact, we see great benefit to things like brain retraining practices. And I'll touch just a smidge on that later, but mostly I'm going to be on the physiologic side. I don't want it to get misconstrued that that's the only side that matters. So mental illness and brain autoimmunity, infections and toxins as root causes. First, an overview of what we're going to talk about today for this presentation is the functional mechanisms of action underlying neuropsychiatric symptoms. There are neuropsychiatric symptoms that include anxiety, depression. We're going to go through a lot of what those symptoms are that have a very strong research-based link to how they occur, why they occur, and what triggers them. So after we talk about the mechanism of action, we're also going to talk about the causes for the things that can trigger brain autoimmunity and how that brain autoimmunity in turn can lead to these neuropsychiatric symptoms. And this is so fascinating to me because it really identifies something that often gets completely overlooked in diagnostics related to things like depression and anxiety. Often brain autoimmunity isn't even considered as a possibility for it being a cause. And that's part of why I really want to make sure to educate people to understand that this is researched. It's just not yet a common practice to look for and test for. I'll talk a little about testing and progress tracking. That's not the main focus here. I really want people to understand what's behind, but I know everyone wants to often hear about testing and how do you know and how do you track progress? How do you understand if changes are happening? So we'll touch on that a bit. And then restoring function and preventing recurrence, because if there is an autoimmune attack and the immune system is attacking self and attacking the brain, and you do some repair on the brain, that might help restore function. But if you don't get rid of the trigger for why the immune system is attacking the brain, you're going to just lead to recurrence. And it's going to happen again. It's going to slip back, slide back. So we also want to talk about restoring function, preventing recurrence. Now, diving into the mechanisms for the onset of neuropsychiatric symptoms. First, I want to say it's often a mystery at this point for most practitioners. Even very knowledgeable doctors, neurologists, people who have incredible amounts of training understand a lot about some of the neurochemical changes that occur, but why those neurochemical changes occur is quite mysterious. We don't know why the norepinephrine levels might be off, but we'll try this selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. We don't know why these serotonin levels are up, but we're going to try this SSRI medication. There's this weird lack of a link behind what exactly is causing changes to these neurotransmitter levels to significant enough degree to lead to mental illness. And that lack is really prevalent. And I'm not going to say that I know the cause or causes, but I will say that there is research talking about the cause in some cases, and it actually may be a lot more prevalent than many people think, especially for psychiatric illness that has never had this kind of analysis done, which is very rare. So what do we mean? What are neuropsychiatric symptoms? That sounds like a mouthful. So here's a list of some of the neuropsychiatric symptoms that have been associated in research and linked with brain autoimmunity specifically. And when I say brain autoimmunity, that's an oversimplified term. We'll get into the details of what that means too. Neuropsychiatric symptoms: anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, sleep disorders, tics, decreased concentration, eating disorders, developmental regression. This is actually going backwards as people develop generally through childhood. There's a progression that happens. People are becoming more developed, they're developing and becoming more mature and more able to have self-awareness, more able to understand their emotional and mental pictures and landscapes and make decisions. But we actually can see with brain autoimmunity a regression in that development where people are going backward. They're becoming more childlike, not in the good, playful type of way, in more the inability to grasp complex and abstract concept kind of way. Aggressiveness. This can be rage, this can be irritability, this can be frustration. People often will say, hey, I used to really not be that upset or perturbed when someone would do something or say something that was a little bit hurtful to me. But for some reason now, at this point, after this illness and all these symptoms started to set in, I'm feeling really irritable from small things. It's like I have to hold myself back from really reacting in a way I'd regret later, because I just want to snap when someone does a little thing that's annoying. And that didn't used to be the way that I was. When someone says that, that's a big telltale sign for me that we might have a brain autoimmunity issue that has onset at some point, because we saw that big shift or change in personality, in the way of being able to handle stress. Sensory symptoms, so we can see visual changes, we can see changes in olfactory or smell sense, we can see changes in the way a person can hear, see, perceive, and sense the world. Motor symptoms, we can also see issues or difficulties with being able to stay balanced, with being able to have function and control over the body in a precise way, which of course these motor symptoms end up being a big issue as people age. One of the biggest causes of death is because someone has fallen in older age, broken a hip, winds up in the hospital, and then has this pneumonia or other infection, this hospital-acquired infection, and they're immobile and their immune system's down. And often this actually is what takes people out. And so there are three big classes of things to watch out for as people age, and those are neurologic issues, blood sugar dysregulation, and cardiovascular are tied together. And then there are cancers. But I actually think that aside from those three, muscles and motor function are actually very important for a person to avoid some of the outcomes that can be negative and stay active. And motor symptoms really can be, I think, a bigger deal than a lot of people realize. Dysgraphia, urinary urgency or frequency. Urinary urgency or frequency often get pinned on a prostate problem in men. And I've seen people go down this, for women, I've seen people go down this this road of interstitial cystitis and finding some inflammation there and uncovering that sometimes there's some prolapse, sometimes there's surgical procedures to try to help that. Often this cause of infection or toxin and brain autoimmunity gets completely missed. Chorea, behavioral regression, so also not just developmental regression, inability to have those complex understandings, but also behavioral regression. A person starts to behave as they did at a younger age when they had less understanding about life, less maturity. So this is an image, and this image is going to help to convey a little bit of what I'm talking about by brain autoimmunity. So when I say brain autoimmunity, specifically what we have researched as being triggered by toxin and infection, which we'll get into the details of mold toxin and other infections that can cause this and have been linked in research to this, we'll get to that. For now, understanding that what happens very clearly is that these dopamine receptor sites in the brain, especially dopamine D1 or D2 receptor sites, the immune system can create an antibody. An antibody, it's like a tag that you're a threat. So the immune system tags salmonella. If you get food poisoning, it tags salmonella and says you're a threat and creates an immune response, an antibody against salmonella. And that's good because then the next time you get exposed to it, it attacks it quicker. And anytime it's around, it gets attacked by the immune system very quickly. So an antibody means that the immune system has created a response against something, which is good when it's a pathogen, not so good when it's part of self, part of your own tissue, part of your own brain, part of your own functioning. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a neurotransmitter that is important for drive. Dopamine is this also misunderstood, but it's this amazing neurotransmitter that it's involved in drive and passion and being able to do what it takes to get something done. A lot of people think about dopamine as reward. It is involved in the pleasure response from having something happen that's pleasurable. It is involved in that, but it's hugely involved in drive, motivation, ability to stay focused and concentrate. it is involved in motor function too. We know Parkinson's, which involves really difficulty with motor control, has a lot to do with dopamine in the brain. And so dopamine receptor sites, there are these in neurons in the brain. These dopaminergic neurons are these neurons that are these things that are transmitting signals related to dopamine. And what happens is that these neurons, these dopaminergic neurons, will get signals from the body to increase dopamine in response to something that happens in life. And they'll produce this dopamine, and this dopamine will go across a gap or what's called a synapse. And then it'll land on some receptor sites, and those receptor sites will have an effect of drive, of motivation, or of a lack of that if there's not enough, or of excessive amounts of that if there's too much. Can be, there's a sweet spot. And so with these receptor antibodies, it starts to attack the receptor sites so that even if there's a production of dopamine that would normally be signaled to be adequate, there won't be a receiving or a receptor ability to have enough of those to get that signal appropriately. And when there's not that signal appropriately conveyed in the dopaminergic neuron, there can be abnormal movements and behavior can change. So people can feel much less motivated, much less drive, much less pleasure derived from life, and abnormal movements are very common. Sometimes it can also go into anxiety and excessive stress as well. Here's some terminology to be aware of that is part of the literature. You may have heard of these things. Pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome, or PANS, PANS, is, so PANS is a diagnosis that points to brain autoimmunity as a cause. Pediatric is weird in there. It means children, but it happens in adults too. It's not like adults don't get infections or exposed to toxins. So it's not an appropriate name, it's an inappropriate name, but it's there because the research started on children. Originally the research started on strep infections. So children would get these strep infections. And all of a sudden they would change in personality over days, weeks, or sometimes even seemingly overnight, sometimes over months, but they change in personality. The kid who was doing so well in school, who was really, the teachers loved him, the kids loved him, was starting to act out, starting to get irritable, starting to behave inappropriately, starting to seemingly go backwards in development, starting to look like obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, depression, any of those issues that we covered as neuropsychiatric symptoms have all been researched and correlated with post-infectious changes in personality. So we're actually dealing the research is very clear. Children will get strep and some of them will be fine and nothing will happen afterwards and they'll seem normal, and others will change dramatically. And unfortunately, that change dramatically often lands them with a psychiatrist whose well-intentioned thought is to give a diagnosis like ADHD or OCD or anxiety or depression and then put on medication. The medication is intended to change the brain chemistry, but not intended to remove the trigger and repair the damage of the autoimmunity or even understand that the autoimmunity was at play. So especially when there's a change and that change is not linked to an emotionally traumatic event. Like, there's one thing if someone is changing after the death of a spouse or a parent or a child, that traumatic event may be triggering something different than this physiology. But if there wasn't some obvious, significant, traumatic event trigger for that change, even if there was stress in the person's life, even if there were things that built up, if there wasn't an obvious significant traumatic trigger and there was a change in personality, that's a telltale sign that there may have been an infectious cause or a toxin-based cause to the shift in personality. Pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with streptococcal infection, or PANDAS, was the original diagnosis because it first was observed in these kids with strep. They changed personality. Why are they so anxious all of a sudden? Why are they having these issues, getting put on all these meds, not responding well to the meds, still having issues lifelong after? There started to be some studies looking at things like the autoimmunity in the brain, response against dopamine receptors, tubulin receptors, and a few other receptor sites in the brain. And research thought, wow, this, I wonder if it's caused by that infection is causing this brain autoimmunity. So it turns out that took some time, but it turns out that there has been very clear and direct research linking brain autoimmunity to these children who are changing in personality after strep. Later research decided to continue and go on to look at, how about other infections? Is it just strep, or is it other things too? And what they found is that it actually can be several other infections, several other toxin exposures that can lead to this brain autoimmunity. So it's often referred to as autoimmuneencephalopathy, and PANS or PANDAS can be often used as a diagnostic term or label. I don't like the pediatric part of that diagnostic term and label. And I don't like that some people sort of get the diagnosis and then don't look into it deep enough to understand that it really is a brain autoimmune issue that's occurring, that's causing this change. Sometimes it just gets simplified, oversimplified into, oh, infection made you have your personality change or have this neuropsychiatric onset, or toxin made you. I think it's very common. A lot of people understand that after mold exposure, after an infection of certain kinds, that their personality has changed and they started to develop these symptoms or these issues. But a lot of people don't really understand the mechanism of action and the physiology behind that. It's actually a protein in the protein structure of certain toxins and infections looks a lot like these receptor sites in the brain. The immune system is really trying to protect and help and get rid of these toxins and infections. And the byproduct is, unfortunately, that receptor sites look similar, and so they often are attacked. So autoimmune encephalopathy, PANS and or PANDAS are often the diagnostic labels, can lead to tics, OCD, eating disorders, anxiety, and all the other ones that I listed as well. And they can onset sometimes suddenly, sometimes gradually, but after this trigger, there is a trigger, there is a cause and or multiple causes triggering this brain autoimmunity. So what are the researched causes that have been shown in the literature to be able to trigger this kind of brain autoimmunity that's causing all these neuropsychiatric symptoms? This is an ever-expanding list, but so far, these are the researched causes for brain autoimmunity. Now, you'll see one of them at the very end there has a question mark. That means it's not yet researched, but there's reason to believe that it could be connected. But mold toxins are one of those that are researched as a cause for brain autoimmunity. So what this means as a cause, what it means is these substances, it's not that these substances in and of themselves, it's not necessarily that Lyme or mold toxins are directly attacking the receptor sites in the brain. It's actually what we call a cross-reactive molecular mimicry autoimmune response. What that means is the protein structure of Lyme we know overlaps a lot with these receptor sites in the brain. And so when the immune system says, I need to get rid of Borrelia burgdorferi bacteria or Lyme, there's an inadvertent attack against these receptors. It's almost like they put out the police bulletin for someone and say, wanted, this person is causing a lot of trouble. And then the dopamine receptors just happen to look a lot like that person, a lot like that infection. And so the immune system, the police force, are sort of mounting an attack against that receptor site. So that's this cross-reactivity piece, where the protein structure is similar enough that in a genetically predisposed individual, this doesn't happen for everyone. Like we talked about, some people will get strep or some of these other infections and will not have an autoimmune cross-reactivity, will not get PANS or PANDAS, will not have this change in personality, these neuropsychiatric symptoms. So there's also, with most autoimmune issues, there's this genetic predisposition that people have. That gene can get turned on. And when that gene gets turned on, it can lead to an expression of this protein overlap and antibody response. So mold toxins, Lyme, Epstein-Barr virus, or mono, as it's more commonly known as. A lot of people get mono and have had it as a kid. It's very rare, actually, that we test for Epstein-Barr virus antibodies and don't find them, at least from a past infection. There are some that show a recurrence and some that show an active infection. Those are a little rarer, but the Epstein-Barr virus that is referring to a past infection is very common. Bartonella henselae is often referred to as a Lyme co-infection because it's also tick-borne, although it's not just tick-borne, it can be transmitted from dogs, cats. It's also cat scratch fevers pointing to Bartonella infection. And Mycoplasma pneumoniae is one of the causes for some respiratory infections. And so that also is sometimes lumped into Lyme and co-infection. Sometimes it's considered separate, but Mycoplasma pneumoniae is another one that has been shown to, for genetically predisposed individuals, to create this cross-reactivity, to create this response against these neurotransmitters in the brain. Recurrent sinusitis, which there's not data about specifically what bacteria or viral aspects of recurrent sinusitis might be linked to this brain autoimmunity, but I do wonder about MARCoNS. I wonder about multiple antibiotic resistant coagulative negative staph that we know has some data suggesting increased sinus infections and inflammation in the sinuses and its biofilm forming. So while it hasn't been researched specifically, I'm curious whether that might be also a potential cross-reactive bacteria. We don't know these ones we know in research. So strep is the one that's most clearly identified originally. These are the additional ones that have been researched post that initial strep research. Herpes simplex, varicella zoster, influenza A, which is just one of the strains of flu that goes around, the common cold, HIV, and we are suspecting COVID-19. I mean, common cold, influenza, Epstein-Barr, many viruses have the potential for this cross-reactive autoimmunity. And we're certainly seeing post-COVID symptom pictures very clearly that look like it might also be a trigger of potential brain autoimmunity. So this is, I know, a big list, and probably almost everyone has had one or more of these things. Almost everyone's had the cold, almost everyone's had Epstein-Barr virus at some point. So having one of these things does not mean necessarily that you'll have brain autoimmunity. Again, there is a genetic predisposition to have the tendency to be able to get this immune response triggered. If the predisposition is there and the trigger is there and the gene is turned on, that's the recipe. That's the recipe for when this can onset. So unfortunately, right now, we don't know how many people have the gene, the genetic predisposition. We also don't know the levels of onslaught that these different things have. But what we do know is that things like influenza and common cold aren't around as long as certain other things stay in the body for a longer time. And of course, if you're continuously exposed to mold toxins, if you contract Lyme and it stays around a long time, then we're going to see a greater amount of time with a trigger present. Because when that trigger, what happens is if that trigger is present and the immune system mounts this attack against, let's say, mold toxins or common cold, and there's this cross-reactive molecular mimicry thing where it's attacking, because there is a genetic predisposition, it's attacking the receptor sites in the brain. If it only attacks the receptor sites in the brain for a week and then that trigger goes down, because the immune system's cleared that infection, or it was just spending the night one time in a moldy building. If the immune system clears that, we're not going to generally see enough damage to cause neuropsychiatric symptoms. However, there are some cases with certain kinds of infections where it can be quick and significant. And of course, those infections that last longer, where the trigger is there for longer, can lead to continued and ongoing expression of these autoantibodies against receptor sites, and we can see continued attack against the brain and these receptors, and continuous change in that neurochemistry in the brain that can lead to these neuropsychiatric symptoms. So when we have some of these for a longer period of time, that trigger becomes persistent, and that persistency of that trigger creates a longer term immune attack against the receptor sites to create sufficient damage to actually onset neuropsychiatric symptoms. So going a little deeper into Lyme as a cause for brain autoimmunity. So Lyme, there's bans, and the testing for Lyme is grossly inadequate. Many people often get screened for it and doctors say they don't have it, but when we do more advanced diagnostic screening, looking at many species and co-infections, we often find some. So the testing is really not great, but many people who do have Lyme, we do see this outer surface protein A, or band 31, on their bands of their Western blot elevated, showing that they're having an immune response against what we know to be Lyme, but also we have a similar sequence, protein sequence, to strep. And strep has that very strong link to this autoimmunity. It's also band 31 in particular has been linked already to autoimmunity as well. So often with Lyme, even Lyme literate practitioners will look at Lyme, will diagnose it, will start to treat it, but maybe don't recognize the brain and parietal cell antibodies that can go with that. So that brain autoimmunity and certain other autoimmunity like parietal cell antibodies, many practitioners are screening for thyroid antibodies and for certain ANA and certain kinds of antibodies, but very actually rare to screen for the brain and or parietal cell antibodies. Part of that's just practical. It's not easy, it's kind of expensive, it doesn't change treatment a lot. So there's that piece that's for good reason, it's not always screened, but it's sometimes not understood either. And when it's not understood and there's not the watching for the symptoms and the change over time, we can see there's almost this ignoring of, or just hoping that these symptoms will get better, and or there's different treatment for these neuropsychiatric symptoms that doesn't recognize this as a root cause. Mold is similar. Mold toxins have this, certain of them have this capacity to trigger this immune response in individuals that can try to get rid of that toxin, but have this overlap with these brain receptor sites and instigate or initiate this process of brain autoimmunity and neuropsychiatric symptoms. There's some studies, there aren't studies that look directly at the protein structure of mold toxin or the protein structure of Lyme and compare it directly to a genetic sequence of the receptor site in the brain for dopamine, there's clear evidence that we see increased antibodies against dopamine, but there is some data on protein structure relationship between Borrelia burgdorferi from Lyme and for thyroid tissue. So this gives you an idea, it can give you an idea, show you some research and show you some pictures that show you a little bit of what this, like how this is happening. So human thyroid autoantigens and protein of Yersinia and Borrelia share amino acid sequence homology that includes binding motifs to HLA-DR molecules and T-cell receptor. So this is looking at Borrelia, which is Lyme, and it's looking at another infection, Yersinia, and it's looking at a shared protein structure or amino acid sequence that includes HLA-DR molecules, T-cell receptors. And when we go a little deeper here, we can see that thyroid autoantigens or thyroid antibodies and Borrelia proteins on this HLA-DR gene, which we know we're looking at HLA-DR genetics in mold as well. HLA-DR and DQ are associated with mold susceptible gene and or multi-susceptible gene. So we're looking at a similar gene sequence, and we know that Lyme protein has on the HLA-DR1, DR2, DR3, DR4, DR5, DR6, DR7, 8, 9. Look at how similar this is. So the Borrelia protein, when they look at the number of copies of these different aspects of the genes, the gray box is thyroid autoantigens, the black box is Borrelia protein, so Lyme protein. And look at how much of an overlap. They're very, very close to each other here in this genetic protein sequence. And here's Yersinia, which is similar. So we know that infections have these similarities on certain genes, and while we don't have the analysis on the gene for mold toxin and for the dopamine receptors specifically, or for antibodies against dopamine receptors, tubulin receptors, or some of the others that we're seeing elevated in brain autoimmunity, there's enough data to link them already to other kinds of autoimmunity and to link that people who get strep infections, Lyme, mold exposure, who are genetically predisposed can have definitely these autoantibody elevations. And we have other research that looks at other autoantibody and does find this very strong protein overlap. So that's that cross-reactivity, that molecular mimicry where the immune system is saying, okay, this structure, this gene protein looks a heck of a lot like these receptor sites in the brain. So as we attack this pathogen, this toxin, unfortunately, the receptor site and the brain become under attack, and over time break down to lead to less ability to regulate neurotransmitters, less ability to regulate mood. Now, there are other root causes for neuropsychiatric symptoms. So brain autoimmunity is not the only root cause. There are certainly nutrient imbalances that we know relate to mood and mood regulation. We know certain nutrients are cofactors for the production of neurotransmitters and are deeply involved in the biochemistry of how the body produces hormones. And so nutrient imbalances, especially things like zinc and vitamin B6 and certain others, are strongly linked to mood. So we can definitely see some nutrient imbalance links, which can also bring us to gut dysfunction and pyroluria. Down at the bottom, pyroluria often depletes zinc and B6 at greater amounts, even if intake is adequate. Sometimes they can be depleted at greater amounts, and people need more zinc and B6 and usually some other minerals and B vitamins as well in order to be able to have all the cofactors for the adequate production and regulation of these neurotransmitters in the brain. Gut dysfunction certainly can lead to nutrient imbalances, and there may be an overlap between certain gut pathogens as well. It's not as clear that gut pathogens would be linked to brain autoimmunity in the research at this point, but there's suspicion that there could be certain gut pathogens. We certainly know that parasitic infections, and we know, for example, toxoplasma can cause intensive and significant personality changes in people. In animals, in mice, toxoplasma actually can make them be more rash in their behavior and less fearful of cats, which is really fascinating because cats are a good host for toxoplasma. And so when it infects a mouse, it'll change the brain chemistry of the mouse to be irrationally non-fearful and be too rash in their behavior and risky in their behavior around felines, around cats. So while we don't have the evidence that in humans, people who get toxoplasma love cats more, we do have a sense that there are linked also neuropsychiatric symptoms from toxoplasma, probably a different mechanism than brain autoimmunity. We don't know if it's brain autoimmunity, but it has these mechanisms to hijack some of the brain function. So certain gut infections could be related. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. We definitely have a link in research to if there were multiple adverse childhood experiences, things like divorce of parents, death of a loved one, significant trauma, abuse, addiction, several kinds of things, if they were present in the household growing up, can add to what we call allostatic load. Allostatic load on the right here is this load of stress that you can handle so much. It's like there's a threshold. Everyone can deal with so much before they go over the top in terms of their ability to maintain calm and stability. So if you keep irritating someone, poking them, like they'll be able to withstand it for a while, but then they'll say, hey, stop it. I can't focus on with that going on. So same thing with stress. Stress has this load. There's a load that the body, this allostatic load that the body can handle of infection, toxin, other onslaughts, lack of sleep, poor diet. The body can handle so much before it's pushed above the ability for it to tolerate that. So the threshold for tolerance, or the ceiling on that allostatic load, once exceeded, leads to chronic inflammatory response and multiple onset of symptoms. And in some cases, brain autoimmunity and neuropsychiatric symptoms are a part of that. So in some sense, it's as if that gene expression of the gene that allows for the brain to be attacked by these antibody responses to triggers like mold toxin, Lyme, and other infections, it's almost like that gene turns on when allostatic load gets sufficient, which is why people could have lived in a moldy home as a child, been fine, seemingly not a lot of problem, and then maybe they moved out of that and they moved again, and then they moved into another moldy home as an adult or as a teenager, and then we see this onset. It could be that the allostatic load was greater at that time. Maybe there were also infections. Maybe there were also other stressors. Maybe there were also traumas and other things that had contributed to that allostatic load being too much. That gene turned on. There was chronic inflammation present. And now we get this autoimmune cross-reactivity. We get this change in neurochemistry. So a brief touch on testing and progress tracking. This is one of the panels called a Cunningham panel that looks at receptor sites against dopamine receptor D1, dopamine receptor D2L, anti-lysoganglioside, antitubulin, and CAMK2. These are the 5 that have been most solidly researched related to the kind of brain autoimmunity we're talking about here. There are many other brain autoimmune responses and markers that can be checked. These 5 are most strongly linked in research to this PANS-PANDAS kind of brain autoimmunity that we've been mostly focused on in this presentation today. So here you see the anti-dopamine receptor D1. So this antibody against dopamine is elevated, the D1 receptor. It's quite elevated in this particular response. And then the CAMK2 is elevated, which can cause a hyperstimulatory activity and also affect dopamine. So this is an example of a panel that would be looking at and diagnostic for this brain autoimmunity. Another example is, this is a different lab. This is a Neurozoomer Plus. And this is looking at, it also looks at antitubulin antibody. It also looks at anti-dopamine. And then it looks at anti-myelin, many others. There's way more than I put on here. I just put the ones most relevant to PANS, PANDAS, OCD, central nervous system issues. So some of these there's many more on that panel that aren't directly necessarily related, but there are lots of cerebellar autoimmunities and autoimmunity to other parts of the brain. But these are some of the big ones. So we can see that there can be, for example, a tubulin elevation in this case is minor. And in this case, we also have the anti-myelin proteolipid protein elevation. And so this is another perspective through which we can look at receptor site antibodies, and we can start to see the effects of the current antibody load. And what's nice about this is that with treatment, we will see these things change. So we will see these if the trigger was identified and treated appropriately, because remember, it could be all these different triggers. It could be infectious, it could be toxin in nature. So we need to, sometimes if we don't see especially changes that we're expecting on the neuropsychiatric symptom picture, we may want to look at some of these kinds of markers and then do further testing and workup around root causes, and then potentially use these as tracking over time to see if this aspect of the neuropsychiatric picture is getting better. We don't always use these because it doesn't diagnose the root cause of why these are elevated, but it does track and help us to understand if we have gotten to the trigger, if we are reducing it, because we'll see these responses go down. Additional testing considerations for root causes are going to be some of the mold markers, mold blood markers, Lyme co-infection testing, so TGF-beta1, MMP9, HLA-DR-DQ genetics, Marcon sinus test, melanocyte stimulating hormone, a visual contrast sensitivity test, surveys for CIRS and multiple systemic infectious diseases as well, parietal cell antibodies, total IgG with subclasses can look at immune function. HSCRP is looking at a different perspective on inflammation. TGF-beta1, MMP9 are inflammatory markers usually elevated through mold toxin exposure, could be other toxins too. HLA-DRDQ is looking at the genetic predisposition to accumulate those toxins and have the immune system not adequately able to recognize and get rid of them. Marcons is the sinus bacteria can produce biofilm and may lead to chronic sinusitis and may be connected with this as well. Melanocyte stimulating hormone is a neuroprotective anti-inflammatory hormone. The visual contrast sensitivity test is looking at the visual responses that get impaired by toxin or nutrients or Lyme or infections. And so surveys help to try to tease apart what's going on, what are the cause or causes. Like I said, it's hard to reduce it down. There might be multiple causes. So someone's treating toxin and it's only getting part-way infection, may be playing a role too. DHEA is an adrenal hormone. Homocysteine relates to methylation. SIBO under stool testing relates to some of the gut dysfunction. Complete blood count and complete metabolic panel, comprehensive metabolic panel are just routine standard labs almost all doctors are doing just to look at things like white blood cell counts and are those impacted by infection, for example, or liver function impacted. Hormones and hormone markers and nutrients are all additional testing considerations to look for root causes, to create a bigger, broader picture for what's going on. And that can really help clue in and hone in on to what extent do we have toxin playing a role, and then is that toxin current or historic? That's where inspection comes in and mold testing comes in, as we need to know is it current or is it historic? Because we could have historic impacting things, still that toxin accumulated in the body and that load still triggering an immune response against self, even after appropriate inspection, remediation, and or getting out of a moldy home, being in a non-moldy space. We can still see the toxin load triggering this autoimmune response for a while until we've addressed that toxin load, gotten that down. And then that reduces the onslaught or the trigger for that autoimmunity, but it doesn't repair the damage that was already done necessarily. So then there's repair of damage done. Here's a brief chart looking at the patients who were pre and post treatment for these autoantibodies. And it's showing basically that the levels change dramatically. So we can see the anti-dopamine receptor antibodies, go down in the treatment group. We can see that there's significant changes with treatment when people feel better. And when they don't feel better, we don't see significant changes in these levels. One of the biggest struggles is how do we track progress and know that we're on the right track and know when to change course and when to add additional testing and treatment. It's one of the big issues. And how do we deal with the medical side of the chronic inflammatory response syndrome due to mold toxin, endotoxin infection? And so it's a big question, but having a systemic approach with specific phases of care is important, where we understand, okay, we're in the diagnostic phase of care, trying to figure out what these root causes are. It's phase one. And then phase two, we're really looking to remove and reduce the burden in the body, toxic burden and or infectious burden. We're really looking to remove that burden. And that can be through removing exposure externally and through removing the load internally. So we're getting that load, we're getting that pressure down. Because remember, we have that allostatic load threshold. So if we're up here with our exposures and issues, then we have a little ways to go before we're going to get below that allostatic load. So we're removing external pressures, we're removing internal pressures, we're getting that load down over time. And then once it gets below that threshold, now we start to see symptoms improve. It's below the trigger threshold. We'll start to see the immune response calm down. But there's still been a lot of damage done that then we go into the phase of repair, where we're looking to repair the damage that was done and restore function. And then we're also looking to remove and reduce the amplifiers, because there are things that amplify whatever toxin, whatever infection is there. Certain stressors, sleep deprivation, certain mental, emotional things can amplify that. So we remove the amplifiers, and then we also repair and restore. And then we look at how do we prevent recurrence and prevent things from becoming issues again in the future. And having some lab objective markers to track and retest on regular intervals is important. And then having some subjective questionnaires to repeat is important, because the mind can do things which are good, like forget the symptoms that you had some months back. And that's good. You don't want to be dwelling and thinking on them. But sometimes people come in and they're like, oh, things aren't going great. I'm having all this gut stuff. And I say, well, what about the migraines? And they say, what migraines? And I say, well, that's the primary reason why you came in for treatment, or was migraines. And they're like, oh, I haven't had those in a long time. So the brain can forget problems, which is good. But if we have these subjective questionnaires to track over time, we can also get a sense for those changes a little better. And then, of course, individual symptom reporting and perceived progress is one of the most important things. If you're feeling better, that's end of the day. What matters is you're feeling better. And so we want also to see lab objective changes, subjective questionnaire changes. But at the end of the day, you want to feel better and get on with your life if you're struggling through some of these issues. Restoring function and preventing recurrence is a big part, and that involves removing the triggers or reducing that noise of toxin, infection, and or other things that might be triggering that immune system attack. So as long as that infectious amount is up, that toxin amount is up, the immune system keeps that attack going. Once you get it down, the immune system calms down that attack. And then reduce the amplifiers. So stress, certain other things can amplify. And so if someone has toxin and infection and the toxin is addressed, but the infection isn't, the infection can be an amplifier, and vice versa. If someone has Lyme and undiagnosed mold is not addressed, it can amplify the immune response and dysregulation that can lead to worsened reactivity to Lyme. Repairing the damage. So we know that brain tissue, certain parts of the brain are damaged. We know there's that autoimmune attack against certain parts of the receptor sites in the brain. We know there's damage to the hormone system and function through toxin exposure, through mold, through Lyme, through other infections and toxins. So we need to repair that damage. But if we repair the damage well, the triggers are still going on. It doesn't work that well. If someone's living in the middle of significant toxic mold and we're trying to repair the damage, it's an uphill battle. It just gets damaged again. So that's why removing the triggers and reducing the amplifiers generally come first. Then repairing the damage and then building resilience. So we want to take that allostatic load threshold and we want to actually move that up. And building resilience, interestingly, can happen a lot through the psychologic side of learning to relate differently to what's happening and doing brain retraining practices and working on the limbic system and the vagal nerve. We can actually see significant resilience or a threshold for tolerance be higher for future exposures and/or issues. Those are the main steps. And I want to just briefly touch on VIP nasal spray and other peptides as being something that can really help with repairing damage done to areas of the brain impacted by mold infections, can help with restoring pituitary gland function and increased melanocyte stimulating hormone, can reset genes related to toxin reactivity and multiple chemical sensitivities, and can help build resilience and increase tolerance to exposures in the future. Now, there are a lot of practitioners who understand VIP nasal spray and use it. So this isn't something new or unique to what I'm doing in my practice, but it's an important step that I sometimes see people drop off before they get to. If you've had mold exposure and you've gone through treatment, you've done binders, and you started to feel better, and you've gotten a visual contrast sensitivity cleared, and maybe you've tested for Marcons and cleared that. If you haven't done the VIP nasal spray, then maybe you've gotten a little below that allostatic load and you feel better, but you're maybe close, and maybe small exposure could push you over that edge again. So what I see is that if we really want to bring that allostatic load potential up and further bring down the current level in the body, peptides are amazing for that. They can help in that repair phase. Here's one study that shows intranasal VIP safely restores volume to multiple gray matter nuclei in patients with CIRS. So this is actually looking at fMRI imaging, and it's finding that the volumes on Neuroquant fMRI imaging show that they are safely corrected with VIP greater than 12 weeks, so greater than 3 months time, greater than 6 doses per day, was able to correct the atrophy or the breakdown of some of the gray matter. That's pretty incredible. And then another study here shows VIP corrects chronic inflammatory response syndrome acquired following exposure to water damaged buildings. And this trial found enhanced quality of life in 100% of trial participants and a correction of T regulatory cell levels supporting the potential role of VIP in both innate and adaptive immune function. So you see how this is boiling back to immune function. Autoimmunity is really tied into this. And the innate immune system and adaptive immune systems are really important to this, and that's part of what the genetics related to mold are testing for. It's the immune system that's supposed to tag as threat toxin from mold and infections and get rid of it appropriately, but it doesn't always do that. And so we know that T regulatory cells and parts of the immune system that are able to adapt to the environment are creating these autoimmune responses, creating a lot of symptom picture. So there are also other things that are not. A lot of people maybe have done some of the peptides, some of the supplements, some of the protocols. Maybe they have not done certain breathing techniques. There's interestingly a breathing technique that showed voluntary activation of the sympathetic nervous system, attenuating the innate immune response in humans. This looked at a breathing study where they injected dead E. coli, which have endotoxin in the cell wall. So these dead E. coli are essentially having this toxin exposure. Endotoxin, we know some people who think they're responding to mold toxin are actually responding to endotoxin. We know water damaged buildings can produce bacteria that produce endotoxins, not just mycotoxin or mold. So that endotoxin, they inject direct into the bloodstream, and this breathing group had significantly reduced TNF alpha, which is an inflammatory marker, IL-6, which is another inflammatory marker, and symptom picture significantly reduced post LPS injection on the breathing group. And then IL-8 and IL-10. IL-10 was increased significantly, and that's an anti-inflammatory cytokine. IL-8 was reduced significantly, and that's a pro-inflammatory cytokine. So inflammatory markers reduced, anti-inflammatory markers increased, symptoms reduced significantly from a breathing technique, which is really incredible. So sometimes breath work, specific breath work practices, and then some other noteworthy interventions. Cold exposure can really impact dopamine levels significantly and norepinephrine levels in the brain. Brain retraining practices and limbic system practices can really help change the nervous system response, which can link to immune response. It can be very helpful. There are other breath practices aside from the one that was researched that are often helpful. Meditation practices can be helpful. So there's a lot more than, of course, we have time to get into, but those are some other noteworthy interventions that can be related to brain autoimmunity and some of the effects of brain autoimmunity that can be very helpful for individuals. And so for me, doing this work and helping people in this way, really what matters is the impact that we can have on people. So here's an example of someone who had been suffering from severe suicidal anxiety for several years, tried everything, was even hospitalized, and then was referred to our clinic, messed in with heart, and we found Lyme, and there was nothing else that had worked for her, and we also found toxin as well, and she's beyond grateful, can't recommend enough. So that's, I'm so grateful that we have the tools to be able to test for, understand in research, apply a systematic approach to some of these underlying causes for brain autoimmunity and mental illness. So my intention has been here in this talk to educate about the multivariable root causes related to mental illness and help restore hope for those who passively resign to their mental emotional landscape. So my hope is that I've achieved that. Thank you so much for watching, and I'd like to open it up if there are questions to answer some of those.
That was great. Thank you so much, Dr. Nichols. I personally really liked when you described the differences between PANS and PANDAS and kind of a little bit of the history of how those disorders became named. Obviously, I have a question that my clients are asked very frequently. So I think that's something that was definitely well hit upon. And I'm going to be happy that we can share this webinar on our website. So if people have questions in the future, we can direct them specifically to you to this webinar to answer that question.
Yeah.
I am not seeing any questions right now, but if I get any of if anybody has any questions, feel free to email us, and then we can forward them on to Dr. Nichols to answer in the future. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just end with one of the questions that I get sometimes is that people want to know, how do I tell if this is a brain autoimmunity root cause versus other root causes aside from a very expensive lab test? And so when I'm doing case histories and looking at how people's historic symptoms have developed, if there was an onset of, if a person tells me, I handled stress pretty well, I wasn't really a person who people would have said I wasn't anxious. I would have said I wasn't anxious. I would have said I really wasn't depressed most of the time. But after I moved here, or after I, even if there's not a known exposure, at some point it flipped for me. And I stopped being able to handle stress in the same way. And there was no obvious significant traumatic event trigger. Then we really want to look at, was there a toxin trigger and or an infection trigger? So if someone says to me their personality changed at some point in their life, and they do not have a very obvious traumatic event trigger, we really want to look at infection and or toxin as trigger in those cases. So that's one thing that I'll just offer out to people, since I get that question a lot.
No, that's a great point, and I'll definitely like. I mean, we always ask when we're bringing in new clients, giving us like a history of like of things like that, and that'll help us try to like push them of like, should we are they really like a good candidate for testing for mold and mycotoxins or VOCs or some other toxins? And this is like that of like changes of like mood or personality definitely can be clues that they have recently been exposed to some type of toxin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. And this is the Mold Pros webinar series, and happy to have everybody here. Thank you, Dr. Nichols.
You're so welcome. Thanks, everyone. Take care
Thanks.
and have a healthy and happy day.